Let's get ready to open up. There we go. Open up to 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 10. And if you can't quote it, if you don't have it memorized, man, you've probably heard this 100,000 times over the past quarter or so. So our study is Grace in Action, Grace Displayed. And subtitle is Anything He Can Do, I Can Do Better. And Paul is the speaker, is the writer here. So let me read aloud in my NIV version of what it is that Paul's saying, and then plug us into at least the nature of our discussion as we go on today. So Paul says, to keep me from becoming conceited because of these surpassingly great revelations, there was given me a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I'm strong. And we've talked a lot about why this doesn't play well, not only in today's current culture, but with Americans. Weak is not something that we believe in very much. Surrender is not something we very much believe in. Us being able to give supremacy in our lives is not really something that Americans buy into, and maybe even different than the Brits, because they have, even as a figurehead or a namesake, they have a sovereign, or they have sovereignty there. America, even though we're a nation, is very, very much built on individual rights. And so the practice of meekness, the practice of mildness, the practice of willingly giving ourselves over to another party's control, it's not something we play well with. So let me pause there. Any comments or any thoughts about that as we take a look at some bullet points to help illustrate this concept or thinking for you before we take a look at some of the Bible patriarchs?
As you were introducing our Lifeway lesson, the question that you read, I don't know that we spent a lot of time dealing with, or the comment that you made after our title, anything he can do, I can do better. I'm wondering whether or not we have spent any time unpacking that or pointing out the significance of that. And it occurred to me as I heard you say it, I'm going, well, we haven't really talked about what that really means or what attitude that displays. And so I thought I would just throw that out there.
Now, and are you meaning in terms of anything he can do, I can do better?
Correct.
So if you've been on the train we've been on for the past 3 weeks, that's been the gist.
Okay, so we're talking about the judgment that they ought to be getting. I can do better and make certain they're more held more accountable for their failures than what.
So the I can do better is, with the exception of Moses, these are folks who've had revelations or they've got directions that, if not are directly from Yahweh God or directly from Jesus, they're from leadership who says this is what you need to do. And they say, I've got a better idea about how to get it done. So if you remember when we were talking about King David last week with the census, he was told not to take a census. And then you read in 2 Chronicles that he takes a census anyway because he wants to sort of take a look at his strength and regale in his pride factor of what he's accumulated, as opposed to what it was that he did when he first encountered Goliath.
Okay, because
And so, oh, go ahead, sir.
I was just I when you read that again, it was one of those things um where our grace that we're supposed to enjoy, we don't, because instead of taking his direction, we take our own. And now I'm seeing the connection between our poster children and that comment. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. So when we take a look at Abram deciding that the plan of his wife that now becomes his plan, well, that's certainly perhaps felt like a better plan than the one that Yahweh God had, and certainly seemed to be more immediate than all the waiting. Um, when, and again, we're jumping a little bit, Will, so we'll get better involved in this and bring you along as we jump to our three patriarchs for today. So we'll get there. We're just rehashing a few weeks to help answer Brother Gene's query. Yes, sir. So when we talk about Jacob, and Jacob's mom and Isaac knowing that the younger was going to rule and reign over the older, well, Jacob's mom took into her own design how to make that happen better and how to make it happen sooner as opposed to waiting on the Lord to make it happen. And so obviously their plan had a lot of trickster elements in it, of which Jacob was a direct activator.
Thank you.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you for the thumbs up. So some considerations as we are thinking about this, anything he can do, I can do better, this grace in action, grace displayed. And remember, this is a follow-up study to our unpacking grace, understanding what it looked like, how it really gets applied, as opposed to just being very cute words of God's riches at Christ's expense. That was the study that we had previous to this. And now this is grace played out, how we should accept it, how we should understand it, how we should apply it to our lives, as opposed to it just being a cute church word. And this passage from 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 10 is grace in action and grace displayed. This is a guy recognizing that he's got a whole lot more on the ball and should be able to accomplish a lot more from his own prideful perspective, and inquires of the Lord to fix the situation. And the Lord goes, nope, you need to rely on me, Mr. Prideful. You need to rely on me, Mr. Boastful, because when you do that, you're going to be giving a testimony and a testament to my power and that I am sufficient. And that's where the lesson is. And that's where we struggle in today's society, in today's climate, to be, and let me make sure that this is understood the right way, society disruptors for Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Because we rely on our own strength, we rely on our own resources, as opposed to relying on the grace and the sufficiency of Jesus. And so our questions that are, what are our Jesus encounters? Folks, if we believe in the sufficiency, if we believe in the abundance of who Jesus is, it's the same as people maybe right now needing to call people up to be aware of the Aaron Judge, Roger Maris home run change. As people on the street talking to each other about pool holes hitting the 700 home run club mark. There are people who have conversations out of the thin air with other folks because these things are so impactful in their life, they have to talk to somebody about it. It's the same kind of excitement that makes these folks spend $1,000 and then $4,000 on the markup circuit to buy tickets to Yankees game to possibly see Aaron Judge break Roger Maris's home run record. That's the kind of dependence that we're talking about for the Christian, for the believer, to so depend on Jesus that he needs to show it through his life. It oozes out of the aspects of his everyday living. And that's what this thorn in the flesh seems to be in some way for Brother Paul here.
Aaron Judge,
baseball player.
Yankees.
He was going for he was trying to break the home run record. He missed it Thursday night. He was going to try again Friday. I don't know if he made it or not. Did he make it?
No, he's still stuck on 60.
Still short. Yeah, he was like 4 feet short Thursday night. So yeah,
Missed
that's been
by
like the,
much.
yeah, by that much. So it's
Okay.
been the news, and then Pool Halls as well because he plans to retire at the end of the season. And I don't like baseball, and I know this information.
Okay, so
And that's exactly what I mean, Sarah. Go ahead, Gene.
that was the other connection. What is the pool hall? I can't make the connection.
They're not
It's not
connected.
a pool hall. It's not.
PDJOLS.
It's spelled PJOLS.
He's a baseball player. He's going.
Oh, that's another baseball
Yes.
player.
It's not-
He's going after his seventh.
Who's getting the cue queued up here? And I couldn't figure out the 700. I'm sorry.
Preston,
800.
I know this, which is scary enough, but I really feel bad for Gene right now.
Thank you. I really thought you mentioned the pool hall, slate tables, and all that kind of thing. Okay, never mind.
So yes, I know just enough to be dangerous about those two names.
Hey,
Yes, because they're permeating our news world and our culture today because they're so important for people to talk about, even though none of us know either one of these guys, and some of us don't even like the teams they play on. We know it.
When they make the national news and you're watching it, you're like, wait, what? So yeah.
Right.
So these are actually people who have names: Aaron Judge and Pool.
I don't know his first name, but Paul's is the last name. I don't know his first name.
Yeah.
Albert Pujols.
Thank you. I can't remember his first name. So,
Okay.
but he's retiring at the end of the season, so he's trying to pass that mark if he can. But if he can't, he said, "Oh well, he's still
Yeah,
retiring."
he's already there.
Yep. Okay. So he did make it. Okay.
Mr. Pujols is already there. Mr. Judge is the guy everybody's watching.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Shutting up. Kind of disconnected the past week, I guess, huh?
I think my husband said he'd married the wrong girl when he starts talking about baseball. No.
So let me throw out some considerations that we threw out last week. I want you to think about the phrase, and if you've got some commentary or pushback on them, especially before we jump into the patriarchs, that's quite all right. So, do I really believe that Yahweh God is in control of everything?
Yes.
I don't know that you're going to have in a church building a lot of pushback on that on Sundays, but I would bet you if you examine some of our lives during the course of the week when we're not in the building, that question would be in some ways on display in some of our behavior.
Well, you got to think about it too, because, we know God's in control, but sometimes we're like, oh, we got this part right here because it's something really easy. We don't think about it. We think about it maybe being more for the big stuff as opposed to everything, big, small, indifferent, whatever the case may be. So yeah, God's in charge of everything, but I still got to deal with this over here.
Well, that also brings to mind another question, Sarah, and I appreciate that because I have the tendency to do that. I got this. But the other thing that I think happens is while we believe, and Will piped up real quickly, he's in charge, he's got everything under control. How many times do we look at the news and go, wow, it's out of control? Well,
Right.
if it's out of control, then he isn't in control. I think we sometimes betray our faith or lack thereof by the actions and the words that we engage in.
It's our humanness.
Well, we have to remind ourselves. That's the thing. It's like if we see, I've seen a lot of bad things, man. And my sister told me when we were in the car, she's like, Will, you have to believe that God is in control because everything is through him and by him. He made the whole earth. He made everything out of atoms. We're talking about God here.
Mm-hmm.
So if he says he's in control, you better believe him. Everything is in his control. We just have to believe it. At least that's what I think.
And see, now that's a whole another facet of this whole grace thing. If he's in control and it looks like to the human eye that it's out of control, we can rest in confidence saying it'll be okay. Not necessarily life, not necessarily the planet, but he'll get glory, and it'll all be okay.
And that goes back to what you said earlier, right? Or maybe Gene, one or the other, about, okay, it is for God's glory. It may not necessarily be the way that we think it's going to happen, right? But it's for his glory. And I think that's where we sometimes can get hung up.
Mhm.
We don't know God's intention.
That's right.
I've got that old dreamy-looking heretic in the room there, Steve, who's probably one of those guys bold enough to consider this, to consider.
Now I have some questions.
Um,
Answer that heretic charge. I want to know what I'm accused of.
So the heretic one I can answer better than the dreamy. So brother Steve and I have actually entertained the question, and we've done it with you all. Is Yahweh a narcissist? Does Yahweh have an ego problem? Right? And I'm glad you're chuckling with me because
Steve's like,
the words are funny and they're bad words from a psychiatry standpoint. And then if it's heresy to consider them in a church environment. But that's where our struggle comes in with this. Yahweh is really in control of everything because we say we believe it, but then we probably don't really, because we struggle with the fact that to say honor and glorify Jesus, honor and glorify Yahweh, honor and glorify the Holy Spirit, those are cute words to say. But if you really think about it, everything is about Yahweh. Everything is about Jesus. Everything is about the Holy Spirit. That's a really tough concept, if not for humans, for Americans to really embrace well.
And I'm laughing a little bit because I was thinking about something similar this week. Because there's stuff that I've been, I like to take deep dives on
our
stuff.
conversation yesterday morning.
Yeah, I was looking at some stuff and I made some connections to some things that were really, really dark,
Yeah.
if true. And I was frustrated by it, and I was like, gosh, I need to resist this. And then I was thinking, well, wait a minute, this isn't a surprise to God. And,
Right.
and if it's happening and he allows it to happen, it's his will. So
Right.
I can resist all I want. It doesn't matter. It's just like, this is his will. And when you stop and think about it, Jerusalem getting sacked in AD 70 was a pretty horrible event. That was
Yeah.
God.
Yes.
The Holocaust happened.
Yes.
Pretty horrible event.
9/11. Yeah.
God's will.
Yes.
This was our conversation yesterday morning when this came up. So I was waiting to see if you would bring it up.
Well, and here we have this. I get that. I've had the discussion with my Presbyterian bosses when I had them. The whole, sovereignty of God, predestination. God ordained that I would take the mirror off the truck, inadvertently. So I get that. Could that have been avoided? But I think there's an interesting concept here with narcissism, because it's like, okay, we have an issue with it all being about Yahweh, because doggone it, we want it to be about us. And that's better. That's our problem. We think that that's okay, but for him to have that mentality is not okay.
Yeah, it's not really, it's our view of him. It's not so much
There you go.
like, it's not really narcissistic if it's true. You know what I'm saying? You're the creator of everything.
Mm-hmm.
All knowing,
All
all
everything.
present,
You
all
already knows
everything.
before you even do it.
It's narcissism. It's just truth.
Okay, and you know what? I get that, and we have the same sort of discussions when it's not bragging if it's true.
Right.
Right? Same thing.
Yes, yes.
I get
And,
that.
and sometimes we need to take a look at that question, even from the wearying kind of experience that Steve had this week, to recognize that it's not that God causes bad things to happen to good people, but it's his will that they play out this way on a scale that's so huge that we can't understand it because we don't have the panoramic vision to understand where it's all going to culminate.
However,
And so, yes, sir.
we've got to have the confidence and faith that it all is going to pan out the way he wants it to. And that's
So
the place to be.
that's Romans 8:28 and 29. And they're scriptures that we quote, but we don't embrace and we don't imply. And that's kind of where this, as we wind down in our lesson, taking a look at the patriarchs, that's exactly where what we're looking at. We're looking at folks perhaps having a head understanding that God is in control of everything, but their emotions went, you know what? I don't like it this way. I like something different. So let's do this instead. And folks, I would challenge that a lot of us church people, a lot of us churchgoers, a lot of us Christians, a lot of us believers struggle with this week by week.
Day by day.
Yes, sir. So if the master of the house was to come this week, would he find us laboring according to what we've been asked to do for him?
Maybe.
Right. And so if the answer is maybe, or something that's not so positive, then we need to examine where we are every week, if not every day, if not every hour.
And this brings us back to this whole intentionality, accountability, because these are reminders for me to get more intentional and get more on target. Because I had I'm going to call it a barren week this past week.
Right.
I did talk to my boss about he last weekend he was at Riot Fest. Okay, I had never even heard of such a thing, and that also doesn't match up with what you might think the name is. And so I went, and they actually had some YouTube recordings that you could play of the groups that were at this basically extensive concert, and I couldn't listen to it. It made no sense to me. It did not make any music appreciation sense to me. It did not sound like music. And this is where he lives. And he doesn't look like he lives like that. So it's amazing to me. Anyway, but other than that encounter, my week was pretty, ho hum, turn on my computer, do my stuff, wait for the next thing, wait for the next thing, wait for the next thing. I went so my point is, all of that to say, I appreciate Preston asking the question to help me to remember that I had that kind of week and I need to do better about engaging people in conversation. Thank you.
I appreciate the description of barren, good brother Gene, because being intentional means that if you're engaged in discussion with your Lord and Savior and Master, you're saying, where are the opportunities? Present me opportunities. So I'm going to remind you that those exist when you go out for dinner. They may not exist when you go out for fast food unless you go inside. When you go to the gym, when you go to do something that involves some sort of a social interaction. Those are all potential opportunities. And then the other key gets to be, and this may take some of us out of our comfort zone, especially with our work at home mindset today that everyone's looking for. You may feel like not only are you sedentary and solitary, but there's no opportunity. So that means you need to get in your car, if not get on your legs and walk through your neighborhood and say, how you doing? I know COVID has kind of made us off limits to people, but you can still from afar wave and say, hey, how you doing? Wonderful day today. Jesus is good. That might get you labeled as a bit of an idiot or a bit of a weirdo, but that may also open the door for why'd you just say that to me? And therein is a door and an opportunity. So Jesus says at least a couple times, at least in Matthew and Mark, and I think maybe differently in Mark and John, you know not when the master of the house is going to return. So keep and I'm mixing up some Bible scriptures. Keep your lamps trimmed and burning bright, so that when the master comes, you are to be praised because you're busy at work for what the master appointed you to do.
Yeah, my head's spinning all those references.
So second question or second thought is meekness versus being a wimp. We talked a little bit briefly last week. No one looks for their obituary or in their resume for someone to say, that Preston, he's a real meek guy. Them's almost times for fisticuffs if that's a resume bullet.
When I was interviewed for my current job, which has changed a couple of times, this would have been like April 8th of 2019. And they asked me a question that had been a while since I've been on an actual interview professionally. And so evidently this is the new thing. Give me 3 words that you would use to describe yourself. Mm-hmm. And like I said, I was not familiar with that. So while I was sitting there in the conference room on Times Dispatch Boulevard, I said, well, I am quiet, I am patient, and I'm cerebral. And that may have done it, I don't know. But that was that was the way I described myself, because that is kind of a meek sort of approach. So I don't know whether that's the way they saw that, but I think there needs to be an understanding that meekness is not wimpiness. I think we need to understand that. It's, and I've used this illustration over the years. Just because something doesn't look like it can take you out doesn't mean it can't. And we actually were talking yesterday morning at the dojo. When it comes to practicing martial arts, I am the quintessential bad uke, because I'm going to be doing the Andy Taylor to Barney Fife kind of thing. Barney Fife is wimpy, not meek. There's a difference there. So anyway, I think we need to understand the difference. The definition in my mind, whether or not it's accurate, you can judge and maybe correct me. Meekness is power under control. Is probably the best way I know to describe it. Just because they don't look like they've got it, don't mean they don't. So, I mean, Jet Li in The Expendables, he needs to get paid more because he's smaller. He has to work harder. He's small, but he can hurt you. So, anyway, meekness is power under control, not the same as wimpiness. That was a diatribe. All right.
So I had a comment for that, but I won't make it because you did such a wonderful job comprehensively covering that, Brother Gene. So I'll move on to the next consideration, and this is one we like more than we want to admit it. God helps those who help themselves. God helps those who help themselves. In the patriarchs, as we take a look at those, that's a lot of what you'll see is folks operating according to their opinion and their directive as opposed to God's grace and God's direction. And a lot of times our ideas are better. Our ideas are better than Jesus's ideas. Our ideas are better than Yahweh's. So for instance, it's way easier for us to reach people through Facebook, TikTok, and maybe Twitter than to go out and meet people person to person. Because that's old-fashioned, antiquated, and Jesus didn't have the technology at hand to be able to reach as many and get as many friends, perhaps, as I have way more friends than Jesus has.
Well, that's a. Mm-mm-mm.
Be surprised.
The the thing that comes to mind, and oftentimes just goes again, is God helps those who help themselves. I think that we have to, when it comes to a grace thing, and this is going to be your heresy, when it comes to a grace thing, while God expects us to rely upon Him, I think there's some responsibility we're supposed to have as well. And we need to identify that and follow up on that. So it's not like we're helping ourselves, but we want to also make certain that we're doing the part that He expects us to do.
I'm in agreement with you there, brother. Thank you for that. Isn't service to the church the same as slavery to Jesus? So this is a consideration, but I'm going to throw out for you that there are a lot of people who serve the church. But contrary to the thinking, they're not always slaves to Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes being at the church every time the door opens up is what makes people feel good. That's what gets their, that's their attaboy. And that may not at all be about slavery to Jesus. It's almost the same kind of thing as when you commit to a club or you commit to an institution. Or there are a lot of folks I know, for instance, who are alums of high schools and colleges, and they're very ardent in their participation. And a lot of times, even though they're serving the organization, why they do it is self-serving. So that's a consideration to have. And then before we jump into these patriarchs, slavery to Jesus might actually be a positive thing. And that was the study that we did a couple of studies ago, which is, what's a bondservant? And I try to avoid the phrase that a lot of modern teachers use, but I'm going to throw it out at least for your consideration and maybe not revisit it again. It's that sold out descriptor. It's that whatever He wants me to do, I will do it. I will be even more undignified than this, if that honors and glorifies my Lord, Savior, and Master. So, any thoughts as we transition to talk a little bit about King Solomon?
One passing thought: the
Yes,
folks
sir.
that are servants to the church. Two thoughts came to mind. Number one, I won't elaborate, but Mary Clarence. Number two, I think sometimes the folks that are servants to the church are confused when it comes to works versus grace, and so their ability to serve the church is how they think they're going to get entrance, when it really isn't that at all. So they're trying to earn their way rather than rely upon the grace of Jesus.
Like money.
Did Will say money?
He did.
Yes.
Yeah, and Will's certainly not wrong about that. The challenge sometimes in our environment is that sometimes folks are dedicated to the church and they don't get paid. You guys know those, the deacons that don't get paid. The trustees don't get paid. The ushers don't get paid. The church board, the leadership board, doesn't get paid. But there are folks who believe themselves to be very instrumental in the church environment, and so they make themselves available for everything that the church might need, and maybe less so for what Jesus asked them to do, which was to make disciples as they go, teaching everyone to be in obedience to what Jesus taught. So we've got a lot of very accomplished deacons. I'd even say even accomplished pastors. who run and operate churches, and they're not about the Great Commission. They do it when the people come into the building, and that may be the only time that they do it. And then the only people that do it when they come into the building are the people with special commission to do that. And that would be the guy with all the degrees after his name that went to some prestigious seminar, and the pastor search committee picked him to do that. As opposed to every single Jesus believer who sits on the pew in the chair who comes in, recognizing that that's all of our responsibility every week, every day as we go. So, so let's take a look we've got three more guys. Let's see if we can perhaps get through these three during our time today. And Sarah was gracious enough to send out a primer during the course of the week, so that if your Bible reading isn't as perhaps consistent as we might like it to be, that you've had a chance to catch up on these three personages. So the first guy is King Solomon, and we're going to take a look at what he does is he unites the known world and expands the kingdom, Jerusalem, via polygamy. And that's captured in 1 Kings 11, 1 through 13. So does everybody understand what it is that I'm saying there with the huge words that I might have used here?
Well, he had lots of wives and concubines, and so and they turned. Well, the wives turned him against God.
Yep.
So because of all that he did with these 700 wives and 300 concubines, then sure he can expand his kingdom, right?
I think that there was a mentality in that time when, and I'm going to use another couple of words, matrimonial treaties. If the Amalekite, will just picking a country, if the Amalekite king's daughter is now married to the king of Jerusalem, I can't attack my son-in-law. So
right.
there's a mentality there where family is regarded, particularly if she happens to live there now. You don't want to hurt her, that kind of thing. So this was one of the ways they actually settled treaties, was by marriage. And so he ended up marrying a whole bunch of women just for the sake of trying to keep peace and bring that quote unquote unity, which I'm not sure how unified they were.
Right. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a challenge because this wasn't in your primer for the week. So, what should Solomon have done?
He should have married one wife and that's it.
Okay, and why?
And
Go ahead. What's there?
And no concubines.
And no foreign wives.
And no foreign wives, right?
Okay.
That's what
Yep.
That's what Israel was commanded to do, because to remove the influence of other religions, to prevent that from entering into their community. That's what he should have done.
Okay. So, because Steve is answering this way, right? So my question next is, did Solomon know that? Did Solomon know what Steve just suggested was the answer?
He should have.
Wisest man
Why?
in the world.
Well, yeah, because he's the wisest man, right? And
Okay.
I mean, he would have been exposed to those commands from God with just discussions and learnings, wouldn't he?
Oh, more than that, the king of Israel was commanded to read the law with regularity. That was part of his job.
Okay.
If he had one job, that was it. He was supposed to know the law.
So he should have known this.
Because he was the arbitrator between the people. That's what a king did.
Yeah. He also had
His father was the king, David. He had
the issues.
He had his issues, but he set the example for no foreign wives.
So
But this,
when you say that King Solomon was the arbiter of the law, what do you mean by he was required to know the law?
He was, I'm trying to remember where it is, but it was basically the instruction that I'm going to say, even from Saul, the first king, although he was a flunky, the instructions were, as king, he was supposed to be reading the law because the function of the king was representing the people to the people. And how can you do that wisely
If you don't know the law.
if you don't know how to do it? If you don't know what the law says about how to deal with this sort of thing. Now, when it came down to the two women fighting over the dead child and the live child, that went way beyond what the law said, and Solomon's wisdom came into play there. But he had to, as a representative of the people to the people, understand what the law had to say. This goes back way to Jethro saying to Moses, "Hey, you're doing too much. You need to get some representatives and expand your judiciary so that people can actually judge in addition to you, so that only the big difficult cases come to you." I think we need to understand the law.
Okay, so maybe I'm not asking the question well enough. What law?
Oh, Jewish law.
Where was that?
We have a hand here.
I have a question. Does this make Solomon a bad king necessarily?
So now you're saying, Will, does his polygamy and 700 wives and 300 concubines make him a bad king?
Right, because he is. If he's in the Bible, and he's and as a leader in the Bible, does that necessarily make him a bad king?
Okay, so that's a great question. The Bible doesn't necessarily label Solomon as a bad king. What the Bible does is suggest very strongly that his character is very bad, perhaps until the end almost of his life.
Okay.
And one
Does
thing,
that make sense?
one thing to keep in mind also is the Bible is also written as a historical document as well.
Right.
So a lot of times what you'll see is it'll list someone and they were a king or whatever, but just because they held that position doesn't mean that they were good. Sometimes it's detailing the things that they did, and sometimes it's like it's reporting the facts. This is what they did. And a lot of times, especially when you get in books like First and Second Kings or the Chronicles, they're saying this was a good king because he followed God. This was a bad king because he didn't. So a lot of times,
Correct.
what they're actually looking at is history. So just because they were in a certain position or they were a leader or whatever doesn't necessarily mean that they're. I mean, let's face it, they're all humans. They're all born bad. They're all sinful. But there are some that followed after God and some that didn't.
Right.
And I think it should be also noted that just because someone's mentioned in the Bible doesn't make them good. And if the Bible excluded everyone who wasn't, we wouldn't have Judas Iscariot. We wouldn't have some of the lessons that Saul turned out to be a real, loser. And let's exclude him and start with the second king. Let's go ahead and just, we have to have those accounts in order to understand the lessons that we can learn from them. So just because they're included doesn't necessarily make them automatically a good person.
Right.
So Will's question is a very a potent one, and Steve's answer is a very a great one as well. And here's why: we probably don't start putting the kings. Let me throw this out for your thinking without making people's heads blow up. We don't start thinking about good and bad kings until after Solomon. Because after Solomon, the kingdom splits. We get Jeroboam and Rehoboam, and I won't do this for too long. But Steve's absolutely correct in that the Bible will reference that the king is a good king based on his following the precepts of Yahweh God.
True.
And when we consider that, potentially after Solomon, there are only probably two guys that get referenced as good kings. And again, you can do some neat homework. The Slack line's available, or you can come in next week with some of those questions. The two guys that are usually outstanding are one we're going to tackle today, Hezekiah, and the other one is usually Josiah. And those are folks that took the pagan worship and they eliminated it, and then they turned the people's hearts back to worship of Yahweh God only. Josiah did that better than Hezekiah did. Jehoshaphat. So there's some other guys who did it partly. But I think that Steve's point is a very good one, is you want to follow not good king, bad king based on the accomplishments from a kingdom standpoint. It's are their hearts attuned to Yahweh God? And that's the measurement. So in that regard, David is a good king because his heart is a heart after God's. Solomon, and this is kind of where we're pivoting right now, where this question comes from. Solomon starts well. In fact, he starts brilliantly, almost better than anybody. And then this wading into polygamy the way that he does, it takes him away the way that Sarah explained earlier. Now, we don't see him aggregating all of his wisdom and recognizing the law that Gene's talked about until we read some of the writings, not so much in Proverbs, but in Ecclesiastes, which suggests toward the end of his life, unfortunately, he reconciled all the mistakes of his youth and not following blindly, in a good way, blindly, Yahweh God's law and edicts. But it looks like he comes around to it, perhaps too late. But if we want to take a look from a historical perspective, the way that Steve is saying, well, David is the guy from a warrior perspective that captures most of the land that is Jerusalem for his son Solomon to then reign over. And Solomon, because of a lot of the treaties and this marriage, the kingdom is as large as it will ever be under King Solomon.
Right. And one of the things that I also wanted to point out about that is a lot of people, I've seen a lot of people sort of mess this up, but they'll say things like, well, look, there was King Solomon, or there was King David, or there was so-and-so, and they were thought of as good. And they had multiple wives. So that means that God approves of people having multiple wives.
Right. Yeah.
And what they're missing is this is just a description of what actually happened. Doesn't mean God approved of it. It's just describing events as they happen.
Right.
So there are lots of people that mix those ideas up and think, oh, it's okay because it's described in the Bible, so it's fine. No, it's just history. They're explaining you things that they did because they actually did it doesn't mean it was a good thing.
Right. Yeah. So many people misinterpret the Bible.
Oh, you think?
Yeah.
So earlier, when we're talking about being the arbiter of the law, King Solomon, here's at least what he had. He had the first 5 books of the Bible, right? Mm-hmm. And remember, when we talk about the sovereignty of God, please don't mix up what I'm going to say, even though it's going to create a little bit of mishmash in your head. God wanted the Israelites to be a theocracy. But the people insisted that they have a human monarch. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, you've got to go back and read 1 Samuel to see where that transpires. That's where they get good old Saul. Because they weren't content having an unseen, all-powerful, invisible, omnipotent leader. They wanted what the other kingdoms had, which is what got them handsome, strong, dreamy Saul.
Is that your word for today, dreamy?
Yeah, it is. It's kind of like, now I am near, now I am far. It's kind of like Sesame Street for today, or Electric Company, yes. So the king had to be instructed by the prophet in order to figure out how to be the king. And Samuel was going to instruct Saul in the first 5 books of the Bible that Moses put down for the Israelites to understand how to operate. And so that, at least, is what was the governing principle for King Solomon. And if you read his prayer in Yeah. Chapter 4 of whichever book he shows up in. Sorry, I'm mixing up Second Samuel and First Kings and First Chronicles. His prayer demonstrates that he understood. And when Yahweh visits him and asks him, what does he want? Do you guys remember what he asked for?
Here's Solomon.
Wisdom.
What
Yeah, what Solomon asked for?
wisdom?
Why does he ask for it?
He had for at least that moment in time, he had a humility,
Yep.
maybe even a smidgen of overwhelm,
Yep.
because we're talking about a whole bunch of folks, and I got no clue, and not so sure Dad David did a great job. So
Right.
he's beginning to realize the arduousness of the task he has, and so he's going, I need a clue, and so he asked God for it.
Correct. And God's answer to him was, not only am I going to give you a clue, and a clue to such an extent that everyone who encounters you is going to understand it, and people will experience your fame from afar, but I'm going to give you all the stuff you didn't even ask for. I'm going to give you stuff you didn't even ask for because you asked rightly.
And therein lies a real neat hint, I think, that is a display that it is genuine humility on his part. If he had been saying, if I do this, God will do that, playing the game,
Right.
so to speak, then none of that would have happened. God would have known. So there's a humongous amount of humility there. And then we do see when Sheba comes, the Queen of Sheba comes,
Yep.
she goes, I had heard, but boy, they didn't tell me half of what's going on here. And so
Right.
this is really, really cool that he really does start out very, very well. But then I think, again, I'm going to blame handlers. Sovereigns run things by themselves, but there are people that are advising them, that are handlers that are influencing them. And I think that's where all these women come from, all these matrimonial treaties come from. And yet he unites northern and southern Israel. That was supposed to happen. These treaties and these agreements with these other non-Israel countries, I'm not sure those are supposed to happen at all. He was just trying to keep peace.
Well, they would have happened according to God's plan. They would have happened according to Yahweh, God's plan. And like Will said, Yahweh, God's timing. Solomon helped to enact some of these attachments or some of these other relationships with the other countries. And when you talk about handlers, we won't see handlers so much in the time of Solomon, but handlers are a direct response to the northern and southern kingdoms when we see Rehoboam show up.
Oh, sure.
Handlers are the reason why the kingdom splits from northern to southern. Because right now, Israel is one. But they won't be after Solomon's death, and the next guy listens to his handlers.
Well, and then he's also got two sets of handlers. And so there's a real generation gap there. Old folks got no clue. So I'm going
Correct.
young people because that sounds stronger. That sounds like what I want to do. And so he does, and all of a sudden, split.
You got it. So if Solomon starts so well, and we know that he starts well because, big, huge church word, you guys can help, the Shekinah makes itself, it covers the temple. So there's a direct endorsement that King Solomon is getting it right with the dedication to the temple, because the Shekinah is resting on the temple. It's dense.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So anybody need Shekinah out there?
Well, beyond that, we even see
Do I need it?
Second Chronicles 7:14. We reference that, but we forget where that falls in Scripture, the context. Second Chronicles 7:14 is God's response to the prayer Solomon praise as he dedicates that temple that just kind of glory dwells in. And so this is a big blessing that Solomon receives.
Correct. That's how right he gets it, because he's almost at this point, and recognize, please, I'm not trying to be blasphemous. He's almost acting right now as king and prophet, because he is so in tune to what it is that Yahweh wants for Israel and wants for him as a young burgeoning king. So we get to 1 Kings 11, 1 through 13, and the Bible clearly says that Solomon expands his kingdom because of polygamy. So here's the question: if we go back to the grace in action, grace displayed, anything he can do, I can do better. What should be the justice that Solomon rightly deserves for what he's done here?
Well, just like everybody else we've talked about, he should be taken off the throne. I mean, if he's not doing what he's supposed to be doing, then he should be removed from office.
Yeah, he should be impeached.
And there you go.
Dethroned, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm hesitant to respond that way, although we've done that, because all of a sudden I'm hearing something that I'd not heard before. What if I mess up? What happens to me? What happens?
Yes.
What is justice?
But that's what we're
Yeah.
talking about. The justice for us is probably death, the same thing.
Yes.
But yet
Yes.
God's grace and mercy says, no, this is what's gonna happen because
Right.
of my grace, his grace, not my grace, speaking on his grace and his mercy.
Amen.
So that's where I think where Preston is going with these guys, because yeah, they deserve to be impeached, dethroned, killed, right? Whatever. But that's not what happens, because God is using those situations still for his good and for what his glory and for what he wants to have happen in his plan.
It kind of reminds me of a question that I saw Frank Turek get once in college. Somebody said, God is so good and so powerful and all these things. Why doesn't he do something about all the evil that's going on in the world? And so Frank looked at him and said, okay, well, let's suppose God started with you. Shut up.
But I think these people that we're looking at, you can almost see yourselves in each and every one of them to a different degree.
Mhm.
Not necessarily polygamy. I'm pretty sure that you don't have more than one wife. I know you
Funny,
don't.
Thank you.
If you do, we got a problem. But I mean, just the situations that they're in, a lot of times you can say, oh, that's very similar to this situation that I experienced or am experiencing. And what happened to them? And now it's like, oh, wow, that's not, so they didn't get that. Oh, okay. So you can almost see yourself in similar situations to a degree.
So Sarah, especially because it looks like Brother Gene had an epiphany there, can you fill in those both, the justice and the grace boxes there for King Solomon?
Yep.
So my feeling is I appreciate that you guys say that perhaps he should have been impeached or he had to step down, but this is such a blatant disregard in terms of honoring God. God almost should have just blowed him up.
See, that's your smitiness about you that you want to do.
But yeah, but you have to keep in mind though, it wasn't just that he married all these women. It's he was also worshiping the gods that these
Correct.
women-
Ashtaroth and Molech and everything else. Yeah.
He needs to be blowed up.
That's your human perspective.
You're right. And he starts so well worshiping, honoring the one, the only God. And now he's got to compromise with all these wives and the Molechs and the Baals and the Asherahs and the Ashtaroths. All of these now need to have some sort of place in his kingdom.
Hence the reason to only have one wife.
Mm.
And make sure that wife believes in the same.
There you go.
It just sort of struck me though, since we're talking, I don't want to get off too far, but it just sort of struck me about how we've been talking about how these guys have messed up, and we were sort of dinging David last week. But then it sort of struck me that there's a time when David really got this really right. When he's being hunted by Saul.
Yes.
My fault.
That's you, Gene. Yep.
When he's being hunted by Saul and Saul is trying to kill him, he has multiple opportunities to take matters into his own hands and just kill Saul, because he knows he's been anointed. He's been anointed to be the next king. And he had at least 2 occasions to kill him, and he said, I will not lay my hands on God's anointed. So he was willing to wait for God to put him in that position without taking matters into his own hands. So, that's an example of it working the way it's supposed to.
So, Steve, the brilliance of your interjection there is, I would almost tell you comfortably that is the Old Testament parallel to Paul's thorn in the flesh, because King Saul represented a huge thorn in the flesh for David during this time that you've just described. And instead of David deciding to take him out, and even David still not even praying for King Saul to be taken out, even though he prays about his enemies to be taken out, he says, you need to be glorified and honored in this, and I will not do that which seems to be against your will. And God brings him through it. Grace is a hard pill to swallow sometimes when it looks like I've got a better idea. If I've got King Saul urinating in a cave, and I can take off his head right now and eliminate him persecuting me because I'm supposed to be the king anyway, and everybody knows that, why don't I just do it?
Yeah, and he's got all of his buddies around him going, there he is, go take him out,
Right.
kill him. And
Right.
he doesn't give in to that.
Correct. So God's grace works for Solomon in that Yahweh informs Solomon that his kingdom will be stripped away, but not during his reign. So we're winding down into the time that I usually take liberally, but I want to throw this out to at least start the conversation, because Sarah just said a couple moments ago, some of the guys that we've talked about, their dilemma aren't things that typically we're challenged with in the same way. So Sarah threw out there, well, you can't be a polygamist. Okay. I would say to you, the next 2 guys are going to have issues that are a little bit closer to home, especially the last guy.
Mhm.
But to begin at least the conversation, at least you having be percolating a little bit. The next guy is Hezekiah, King Hezekiah, and King Hezekiah is one of my favorite kings, because he so trusts Yahweh God. He really, really, really does. And you've got to read his account in Kings and Chronicles to understand how much he loves Yahweh God and how much he relies on him, because he gets at least a couple of gifts, because he really does. His heart is according to Yahweh God, even though he's going to blow it in this passage we're going to take a look at. And so in 2 Kings 12, no, it's not. Oh, well, what did I? 2 Kings, I guess I forgot the verse.
That was I meant to fix that. Sorry. I saw that. I meant to fix it. I apologize.
In 2 Kings, some chapter, verses 12 through 19. Hezekiah shows off his wealth and possessions to his Babylonian pals.
I wrote it in the email. I know I wrote it.
And as we wind down for today, anybody understand why this might not have been a good thing?
Especially if you knew anything about the Babylonians at this point in time. It wasn't how ISIS do. Go, hey, check it out. Look at all this stuff that I have. That's nice. We'll take inventory, so we'll be back to this later.
2 Kings 18, 12 to 19. I believe
Thank you
it's,
very much.
it's chapter 18.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I had to go back and look at my notes.
Now, you know what? To jump on Steve's history track, and this might be just a little bit of fun before we discontinue for this week. The Babylonians were perhaps bad, but remember now, Hezekiah he's inviting his Babylonian comrades, his Babylonian peers, his Babylonian ambassadors. So at the time, they're not considered the Babylonians that will be later. So from an historical perspective and from a Bible perspective, who are the baddest of the bad guys right now when King Hezekiah is entertaining the Babylonians? Who are the bad guys at this point in history?
Assyrians.
You can
Assyria.
you can almost say Assyrians any period of time.
The first terrorists.
Yes, for real.
Right. The Assyrians were so bad that those are the guys that are credited with inventing crucifixion. The Assyrians would create the kind of torture that perhaps we don't see happen in a society until we see the Romans. They were arduous and intentional in the ways that they would extract information or torture folks that they had defeated. And the Assyrians were the bad guys. And if you want a little bit of a taste of how bad they were, this is why the book of Jonah.
Mhm.
This is why when Yahweh tells Jonah to go to the capital of Assyria, Nineveh, Jonah, by the way, is not in this study. Jonah has a way better idea. Jonah's idea is
To go the opposite direction.
Jonah! Yeah, it's so, I mean, this is telling because Jonah heads the other direction because he knows the mercy of God. And he knows that he's so merciful that Yahweh is just not going to give him the comeuppance they really need to get. He doesn't go to Nineveh, the capital of Assyria. He goes the other direction completely because if I preach to them and they hear the good news, they're going to repent and God's going to bless them and forgive them. And I'm just not interested in that occurring because I like for them to get their just deserts. That's
correct. And that's why Jonah's not here in this grace discussion, because Jonah is a guy who understands God's grace, even though he denies it kind of repeatedly during his book. And you've heard me say through the years, Jonah is the only book of the Bible that ends
In a question.
with a question.
Yep.
Answer the question. Because Jonah is absolutely unhappy that God is so gracious. He hates it. So Jonah's a guy who understands the greatness of God's grace. He understands. And there's a fun, as we look back thousands of years, to see Jonah making a choice that doesn't operate, as he thinks, according to God's will, because of the immense graciousness that Yahweh is going to afford to people that are set up as their most ruthless enemies prior to Babylon. So we're about to end. Any thoughts, any comments, any historical things? Did I get most stuff right today, Steve?
Yeah, I mean this is a period where the Assyrians are the big bad empire. They really had an understanding and appreciation of how to cultivate fear to control people. The Babylonians were starting to feel their own. They were sort of like a vassal state of the Assyrians, and they were starting to feel their own strength, and were starting to feel like we can sort of throw off this vassalship, but they aren't quite there yet. But they're getting there.
At some point in time, maybe we'll have less of a Bible study and have maybe a history study to understand the empires that came against and ultimately kind of subjugated Israel. And it just gets funny because when we read the Gospels, I think in John chapter 8, we're going to have the elders, the Sanhedrin or representatives say, we've never been slaves to anybody, because They've forgotten their history. They've been slaves to everybody. And so Hezekiah is going to be a little bit of a fun study as we take a look at him doing something that, look, visiting ambassadors, excuse me, when you go to England, the Queen of England, the previous Queen of England, and probably King Charles, they're going to show off what the things that they possess that make them king. If you were to visit the Emperor of Japan, he's going to show off some of the things that make him the emperor. Well, that's what Hezekiah is doing here. That's just kind of what a king does, right? So that's kind of the question.
I think
the question we're going to pose for next week. Go ahead, Steve.
That's probably part of it. Other part of it is probably it's probably an attempt to say, look, we can be friends against these Assyrians should the need arise. Look what we've got. So yeah, it's definitely pride seeking. It's pride and alliance building, which also shows though he's not necessarily relying on God. He's thinking, I need some friends.
Well, I think that there's a duality in my mind here, and I'm kind of confusing. I'll admit it. I'm confusing 21st century mentality with Solomon having shown the Queen of Sheba all of what he had. And let's face it, if somebody comes into my home and they're sketchy, I'm not going to show them all the stuff they might like to break in and get later on in the 21st century mentality. On the other hand, we see the praise that the Queen of Sheba rains upon Solomon for all his wealth, and I hadn't even told half of what you guys got going on. So I can see Hezekiah kind of being caught in the middle of that. But yes, I also see the lack of dependency based upon his wealth and his pride, all that. That's not resting in the Lord. I think you're right.
So let's keep that in mind when we discuss Hezekiah a bit next week in terms of the motivations perhaps that he had to do that, because I think we're spot on when we're talking about pride and we're talking about building alliances in our own strength and according to who we think should best partner with us, right? As opposed to relying on Yahweh or relying on Jesus to allow us to know how that works. So that'll be part of our discussion. And then we'll close our patriarch discussion chatting about good old
John Mark.
Good old Mark. We know him as Mark, but important to classify him as John Mark. Go ahead, Gene.
One other thing that comes to mind with regard to Hezekiah is, and this is my faulty memory, so we can look at it next week. Number one, there's an occasion where he gets we used to call them at Liberty nastygrams, okay? He gets some nastygrams saying, okay, this is going to be happening and it's not good. So he lays it out before the Lord and says, what do you think I should do? And then he does it and all goes well. But then another event takes place that's not a nastygram, and he goes, I got this. I know what to do on this occasion. And he doesn't trust the Lord. He doesn't seek his advice, and things don't go quite so well. And I think we need to remember those events as we look into his showing off his stuff.
I think you're very right there. Hezekiah is going to have maybe 2 and maybe 3 miraculous events occur for him during his tenure as king. He blows it. It looks like kind of one time, but the one time has its consequences, of which we'll discuss next week.